The Church of St. Thomas stood silent under a heavy, gray sky in a small Iowa town. Its old wooden beams creaked as the wind howled outside. Inside, the air was thick with sorrow. The church bells rang out slow, mournful tolls. They blended with the quiet sobs of the mourners. It created a haunting, heart-wrenching atmosphere. Sarah knelt beside her husband James's coffin. She held her 3-year-old daughter, Emily, tightly in her arms. The little girl squirmed against her mother's grip. Her small face was red from crying too much. Sarah tried to comfort her, whispering soft words. But Emily wouldn't calm down.
Her big, innocent eyes stared at the wooden coffin where James lay still. "Daddy! Daddy!" Emily sobbed. Her tiny fingers trembled as she pointed to the coffin. Sarah's throat tightened. She clutched her black shawl, fighting back her own tears. James's sudden death felt unreal. Just yesterday, he'd hugged her goodbye before heading to the fields. Now, all that remained was a lifeless body. The villagers gathered around Sarah. They whispered to each other in low tones. No one could explain how a strong man like James had died so suddenly. Some said it was a farming accident. Others muttered it was a curse. Mrs. Agnes, an elderly woman with kind eyes, stepped closer. She placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "My dear, I know this pain is unbearable," she said softly. "But Emily, are you sure she's all right?" Sarah looked down at her daughter. Emily was shaking. Her wide eyes were fixed on a shadowy corner behind the coffin. Suddenly, the child let out a sharp scream. "Daddy's trapped. He's calling me," she cried. The air in the church grew heavy with tension. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some villagers exchanged nervous glances. Others quickly made the sign of the cross. Mrs. Agnes stepped back, her hand over her mouth. "Good Lord, the child sees something," she whispered in a trembling voice. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She turned to Emily, trying to steady her voice. "Sweetheart, what did you say?" she asked. Her heart pounded with fear. "Daddy's there. He's calling for help, Mama. He's trapped," Emily insisted. She kept pointing at the dark corner. A chilly breeze swept through the church. The candles on the altar flickered. No one spoke. Sarah felt the tension thicken around her. Just then, the church doors creaked open slowly. A tall man stepped inside. His face was stern. It was Thomas, James's older brother. He wore a dark coat. His sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Sarah. He walked toward her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, you must be worn out," Thomas said. His voice was deep and smooth, but it felt hollow. "We're all devastated about James." Sarah nodded slightly. She was too tired to reply. Thomas glanced at Emily. The little girl still clung to her mother's dress. She stared at the corner. "She's too young to understand," Thomas said. His tone had a subtle edge. "It's best not to let her say such things. It might scare people." Sarah frowned. His words unsettled her. "She's just missing her father," she replied. She tried to keep her voice calm. Thomas nodded, but his expression shifted. "Sarah, I hate to mention this now," he said, "but James left some debts behind. The farm, it might be smart to sell it to clear them." Sarah froze. A wave of dizziness hit her. "Sell the farm? What are you saying?" she asked. Thomas sighed, his concern sounding forced. "James was a good man, but he had troubles. I'm only thinking of what's best for you and Emily." A cold dread settled in Sarah's chest. She'd never trusted Thomas. And now, with James barely gone, he was talking about money. Emily suddenly gripped her mother's hand tighter. Her eyes shone with tears. She pointed at the coffin again. "Daddy's trapped," she said. Her small voice was clear and firm. Thomas's head jerked toward her. His face went still for a moment. The church grew quieter. People nearby stepped back. No one dared to speak. Sarah knelt down. Her heart raced. "Emily, what did you say?" she asked. Emily looked up at her. Her tiny face was full of fear. "Daddy hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for Mama." A heavy silence fell over the church. A woman nearby, Martha, whispered to her neighbor, "This isn't right. A child so pure wouldn't make this up." Sarah squeezed Emily's hand. She tried to stop her own trembling. Thomas clenched his jaw. His eyes flickered with unease. "Kids have wild imaginations," he said. He forced a laugh, but Sarah saw his hands curl into fists. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew something was wrong. Darkness seemed to spread through St. Thomas Church. The candles flickered weakly. The air felt heavier than ever. After Emily's words, the mourners moved back. They avoided Sarah and her daughter. It was as if they feared what might happen next. "Daddy hasn't left. He's still here. He's calling for Mama." Emily's words echoed in Sarah's mind. They sent chills through her body. She looked around the crowd. Her eyes stopped on Thomas. He stood there, but he seemed nervous. His fingers tapped against a pew. His gaze darted away. "Let's not let a child's words cause panic," Thomas said. He forced another weak smile, but his voice shook slightly. Mrs. Agnes made the sign of the cross. She murmured quietly, "There are things we don't understand. Sometimes children see what we can't." Sarah's body shuddered. She held Emily closer. Thomas blinked quickly. He turned back to Sarah. "Sarah, I'm just trying to help," he said. "We should settle the farm and debt soon." If James were here, he'd want it handled fast. Sarah's stomach twisted. "Please, leave me alone for a moment," she said. Her voice was firm. Thomas shrugged. A flash of annoyance crossed his face. "I'm only helping," he said. "But if you're too stubborn, I might have to get the law involved." His veiled threat made Sarah's blood run cold. Martha clicked her tongue. She whispered to someone beside her, "He's heartless. James isn't even buried, and he's after the farm." Thomas ignored the murmurs. "I'll return tomorrow," he said. "Hopefully, you'll see reason by then." He turned and walked out of the church. Sarah's heart pounded. It wasn't just his threat. It was how he reacted when Emily spoke. Why had he looked so tense? She looked down at Emily. The girl still clung to her dress. "Mama, Daddy's still here," Emily said. Sarah took a deep breath. She tried not to panic. "Emily, what do you mean Daddy's trapped?" she asked. Emily looked up with teary eyes. She whispered, "Daddy's stuck in there. He's calling me. He's scared." The words sent a shock through Sarah. She stared at the coffin. It was solid oak, tightly sealed. But she couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Mrs. Agnes shook her head beside her. "The child isn't imagining this," she said. "I've seen it before." Sarah turned to her. Her pulse raced. "What do you mean?" she asked. Mrs. Agnes paused. Then she spoke in a low voice. "Long ago, a man was buried. They thought he was dead, but he was in a deep sleep. His family dreamed of him after." She trailed off. Her face looked haunted. Sarah's throat went dry. She glanced at the coffin. A growing fear crept into her mind. Emily hiccuped. "Daddy's calling me," she whispered. Sarah's chest tightened. A shiver ran through her. No, it couldn't be. James was dead. But was she sure? Outside, the wind moaned through the stained glass windows. It made an eerie sound. The altar candles flickered. One went out. Villagers exchanged worried looks. They murmured to each other. "This is a bad sign," a woman said. The tension in the church grew. Sarah felt the walls closing in. What should she do? It could be a coincidence. But what about James? She held Emily close. Her heartbeat thumped in her ears. Martha stepped nearer. She whispered, "Sarah, if you have any doubt, don't let them bury him yet." The words struck Sarah hard. She didn't know what to believe. But one thing was clear. Something was very wrong. St. Thomas Church stayed dark. The funeral dragged on longer than planned. Whispers grew louder. They were filled with unease. Villagers stepped away from the coffin. They seemed afraid to get too close. Sarah stood frozen. Her mind was a storm. Emily still held on to her. Her innocent eyes shone with fear. "If you have even the slightest doubt, don't let them bury him yet." Martha's words rang in Sarah's head. She wanted to think it was just Emily's grief. But deep down, a nagging feeling grew. Thomas had left. But his reaction to Emily's words lingered. It made Sarah more uneasy. Mrs. Agnes tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "My dear, trust your heart," she said. Her voice was low and serious. Sarah looked at Emily. The girl's small hands clutched her dress. They trembled. "Mama, Daddy's scared," Emily said. A chilling cold ran through Sarah. No, it wasn't possible. James was dead. But what if he wasn't? The thought made it hard to breathe. She gripped Emily tighter. She tried to find reason. The villagers' fearful stares surrounded her. The air felt heavy with dread. Suddenly, a voice called from outside. "Sarah!" She turned quickly. Paul stood at the church entrance. He was James's close friend. He was out of breath. His face was tight with worry. "I just heard," he said. "I got here late." "There's something you need to know." Sarah's heart hammered. "What is it?" she asked. Paul walked toward her. He lowered his voice. "Before James died, he told me something," he said. "I don't know if it's the right time, but it's about Thomas." Sarah stiffened at Thomas's name. "Tell me," she said firmly. Paul glanced around. He made sure no one was listening. "A few days before James passed," he said, "he told me Thomas kept pushing him to sell the farm. James said no. The next day, he had his accident." A wave of ice washed over Sarah. She remembered Thomas's words earlier. He'd urged her to sell the farm. He'd stayed calm when Emily spoke, but only on the surface. Could it be no accident? Her hands shook. "Paul, are you saying—" she began. Paul swallowed hard. "I have no proof," he said. But James didn't trust Thomas. "He told me if anything happened, don't trust anyone." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. No, it couldn't be. But it was starting to make sense. Emily tugged at her sleeve. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Mama, Daddy's crying," she said. The church went silent. Mrs. Agnes stepped back. Others in the crowd stared. Their dread grew. "She can really see him," someone whispered. Sarah swallowed hard. She turned to Emily. "What did you say?" she asked. Emily pointed at the coffin. Her voice was a faint whisper. "Daddy's crying. Daddy's crying inside." The cold room felt suffocating. Sarah's blood turned to ice. No, it couldn't be. But then a soft sound came from the coffin. Thud. No one spoke. No one moved. Was it her imagination? Then it came again. Thud, thud. This time, everyone heard it. The crowd stirred. Mrs. Agnes trembled. She made the sign of the cross repeatedly. "Dear God," she whispered. Martha stammered. "Sarah, we need to open the coffin." Sarah couldn't breathe. She started to step forward. A voice shouted, "No one touches it!" Everyone turned. Thomas was back. He stood at the church entrance. His eyes burned with anger. "Don't let superstition cause chaos," he said. "This is nonsense." But Sarah's fear deepened. She looked around. The villagers trembled. Their eyes flickered with doubt. Thud. Thud. Another sound. Sarah's face paled. Thomas clenched his fists. His voice carried a warning. "No one's opening that coffin," he said, but his words made Sarah more sure. He was hiding something. The church fell silent. Fear spread like wildfire. The knocking from the coffin froze everyone. The altar candles cast shaky shadows. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She stared at the oak coffin. Emily had said James was crying there. "No one's opening the coffin," Thomas shouted. His voice was sharp and panicked. "Calm down," he said. "It's just the wind." The wood settling, but no one believed him. "Wood doesn't knock like that," Mrs. Agnes whispered. Her eyes were wide. An old man, Mr. Henry, stood up. He'd known James's father. His voice was steady. "Thomas, why are you scared to open it?" he asked. "If you've nothing to hide, let us look." "I'm not scared of anything," Thomas yelled. But Sarah saw his hands. They were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Paul stepped forward. His eyes were hard. "Then let us open it," he said. Thud. The coffin knocked again. Several women gasped. They clung to each other. The quiet funeral had turned into a nightmare. Emily held her mother's dress. Tears filled her big eyes. "Mama, Daddy's calling you," she said. Sarah shook. But a fire grew inside her. She looked at Thomas. Her fear turned to certainty. "What are you hiding, Thomas?" she demanded. Her voice was raw. Thomas's eyes widened. "Are you crazy, Sarah?" he said. "You'd open a coffin over a child's story?" "And the knocking," Sarah shot back. "The wind," Thomas roared. "I told you, it's just the wind." "Then let us open it," Paul said. He stepped closer. "Prove you're right." No one spoke. The church held its breath. Thomas swallowed hard. He stared at the coffin. It was like he saw a monster. "No!" he screamed. His voice broke. "No one touches it." But his outburst damned him. Mr. Henry spoke again. His old voice cut through. "Thomas, you're making yourself look guilty," he said. Thomas glared. His lips pressed tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Emily suddenly screamed, "Daddy! Daddy, I'm here!" Her cry echoed. Sarah felt the floor shake. Thud! Thud! The knocking grew louder. It was too real to ignore. Some villagers ran for the door. Others stayed rooted. Their eyes were wide with horror. Martha's voice shook. "If something's wrong, we have to check," she said. Mrs. Agnes took a deep breath. "Call the priest," she said slowly. "If a soul's trapped, he can help." Thomas paled at the word priest. "No one's calling anyone," he barked. But Sarah was done with lies. She turned to Paul. "Go get Father Daniel," she said. Her voice was strong. Thomas lunged at Paul. He tried to stop him. Mr. Henry grabbed his arm. "You've no right to stop us," Mr. Henry said. His tone was cold. Thomas yanked free, but fear shone in his eyes. The church bells rang outside. Their sound shook the air. Paul ran to fetch the priest. Sarah stood before the coffin. Her heart pounded. Emily hiccuped. "Daddy's waiting for Mama to open the door," she whispered. A shiver ran through Sarah. Was her daughter right? Or was it just grief? But the knocking, Thomas's fear, it meant something. She looked around. The villagers' faces were struck with terror. This was no normal funeral. Mrs. Agnes prayed quietly, her hands pressed together. Martha gripped her shawl. "If James isn't dead," she murmured, "we might still save him." But what if it was too late? The thought stabbed Sarah's mind. She couldn't wait. Priest or not, Thomas or not, she'd find the truth. The bells kept tolling. Their heavy chimes filled the air. No one mourned James now. Fear had taken over. Thud, thud. The knocking grew desperate. Sarah's body froze, but her mind screamed, was James alive? It couldn't be. But what if he was? Cold sweat ran down her back. She held Emily's hand tight. The little girl sobbed. Her face was full of fear. "Mama, Daddy's calling for help," she said. Mrs. Agnes whispered a prayer. Villagers backed away. They were too scared to near the coffin, but they couldn't look away. Paul was gone for the priest. But Sarah couldn't wait. "We have to open it now," she said. Her voice was clear. It hit like lightning. "No!" Thomas roared. He charged forward. His eyes were wild. "Are you insane, Sarah?" he yelled. "This is ridiculous." "Who opens a coffin at a funeral?" Sarah faced him. "Then explain it, Thomas," she said. "What are those sounds?" Thomas's fists clenched. "It's the wind," he said. His voice cracked. "I told you, it's the wind." "Do you think I'm a fool?" Sarah shouted. Her eyes burned. Thomas opened his mouth, but Paul appeared at the door. "The priest's coming," he said. "No one touch it till he's here." "No," Sarah cried. "I can't wait." She lunged for the coffin. She reached for the lid. Thomas rushed forward. He grabbed her wrist. "Sarah, don't be stupid," he growled. He squeezed hard. Pain shot through her arm. "Let me go," she yelled. The church gasped. Thomas's aggression shocked them. He kept shouting, "You can't open it. It's disrespectful." "Or are you scared?" Sarah said. Her words cut deep. Thomas froze. Sarah pushed him off. She moved to the coffin. Paul and Mr. Henry stepped up. "If James is dead, we'll see," Paul said. "But if he isn't—" Mr. Henry's voice was icy. Thomas's face went white. "No!" he screamed. But no one listened. Sarah put her hands on the lid. Emily whispered through tears, "Daddy." Sarah took a breath. She was ready. But then, slap. Thomas struck her face. A gasp filled the church. Sarah stumbled back. Her head spun. Paul roared. He grabbed Thomas. "What's wrong with you?" he yelled. Thomas fought. Paul punched him hard. Thomas fell to the floor. Sarah ignored them. Her hands stayed on the coffin. The knocking didn't stop. Thud. Thud. Tears ran down Emily's cheeks. "Mama, Daddy's knocking," she said. Sarah's jaw tightened. Her chest ached. She didn't care about Thomas. She didn't care about objections. She'd opened the coffin. She had to know. Thud. Thud. The sound grew louder. It shook the church. No one could deny it. Something was inside. Sarah's heart beat like a drum. She gripped the lid. She breathed deep. "Open it," she said. Her voice was firm. But a scream rang out. "No!" Thomas lunged again. His eyes were red. His face twisted in terror. "No one opens it!" he yelled. "Leave James alone!" Paul punched him again. Thomas crashed down. He groaned in pain. "Don't open it!" he shrieked. "Don't open it!" Sarah shook with anger. "What are you so afraid of?" she asked. "I'm not afraid!" Thomas screamed. He thrashed like a madman. "You don't understand. Don't open it." Sarah had no patience left. She turned to Paul and Mr. Henry. They nodded. Her hands shook, but her will was strong. She gripped the lid. Emily sobbed. She held her mother's dress. "Mama, Daddy's scared," she said. Sarah bit her lip. She started to lift. "Sarah, stop!" A deep voice boomed. Everyone turned. Father Daniel had arrived. His black robes swayed. His face was serious. "What are you doing?" he asked. Paul stepped forward. "Father, something's wrong," he said. "There's noise from the coffin. We have to open it." priest walked forward. His eyes scanned the crowd. They settled on Sarah. "Are you sure?" he asked. Sarah's breath caught. Was she sure? Emily squeezed her hand. Her teary eyes shone. "Daddy's scared," she said. Her words pierced Sarah's heart. She took a shaky breath. She looked at the priest. "I'm not sure," she admitted. Her voice trembled. "But I can't bury James with doubt." Father Daniel nodded. He stepped to the coffin. The church went silent. No one breathed. He touched the lid. A stillness filled the room. Then thud, thud. Another knock, louder, more urgent. Mrs. Agnes screamed. Villagers ran for the door. Thomas moaned on the floor. "Don't open it," he mumbled. "You'll regret it." No one listened. Sarah met the priest's gaze. He nodded. "Open it," he said. But a voice shouted, "Wait!" Everyone turned. A man burst in. He was panting. His clothes were messy. It was Dr. Ellis, the town doctor. "Stop!" he yelled. "Don't open that coffin!" The church froze. Sarah's eyes widened. "Why?" she choked out. Dr. Ellis ran forward. Sweat dripped from his face. "There's a mistake," he gasped. "I checked James's records." "Something's wrong." No one made a sound. Paul's fist tightened. "What do you mean?" he asked. Dr. Ellis swallowed. His face was grim. "The death papers were odd," he said. "No one at the clinic confirmed it. It wasn't official." The air turned cold. Sarah's body went numb. Thomas let out a choked cry. "No, no, no," he said. Paul's voice thundered. "What does that mean?" Dr. Ellis faced Sarah. His voice was heavy. "It means James might not be dead." The church erupted in screams. Sarah fell to her knees. She held Emily. Emily sobbed. "Mama, I told you," she whispered. Sarah's eyes widened. Her shaking hands gripped Emily. She turned to the coffin. She reached for the lid. "No!" Thomas screamed. He lunged like a madman. The church doors slammed shut. Everything went dark. The doors banged closed. Screams filled the air. Villagers pushed each other. They tried to escape. But the doors were locked. The smell of damp wood and candles mixed with fear. Sarah held Emily close. The girl's small body shook. "Mama," Emily whispered. Her voice was tiny. Sarah squeezed her hand. Her heart raced. "It's okay, baby," she said. "Mama's here." A voice cried out, "We can't stay here. We need to open the doors." A man banged on the doors. They didn't move. "Who locked them?" he yelled. Paul checked his phone. No signal. Mrs. Agnes prayed fast. "This is a sign," she whispered. "A punishment." Sarah tried to stay calm, but she knew something was wrong. "Open the doors!" a woman screamed. No one answered. Then, laughter. Wild, crazy laughter. Everyone turned. It was Thomas. He stood in the middle. Sweat poured down his face. His eyes were bloodshot. "Don't open the coffin," he howled. "Don't open it." His voice was weak now. Father Daniel stepped forward. "Thomas, what do you know?" he asked. His tone was firm. Thomas stumbled back. He shook his head. "No, don't ask me," he said. "Don't ask." Paul grabbed him. "What did you do to James?" he yelled. Thomas broke. He wasn't the strong man anymore. He fell to the floor. His body shook. "I didn't mean to," he said. Sarah's fists clenched. "What did you do?" she demanded. Her voice was sharp. Thomas sobbed. His words were broken. "I just wanted the farm," he said. "I told James to sell." "He wouldn't." A chill hit Sarah. "So you killed him?" she asked. "No," Thomas screamed. He collapsed in sobs. "I didn't kill him. I wanted to scare him. I put something in his drink. Just to knock him out. But he didn't wake up." The church went still. Sarah's world spun. Her ears rang. "You drugged my husband?" she said. Thomas nodded. Sweat dripped from him. I didn't know he'd react, he said. I didn't know. When he didn't wake, I panicked. So you faked his death? Paul growled. Thomas shook. I had no choice, he said. I paid someone for the papers. I thought he was gone. You thought? Sarah's voice broke. Her fists shook. You didn't check? Thomas looked down. I was too scared, he said. And you let them bury him. Thomas sobbed. No, I didn't know, he said. I didn't think. He stopped. Bang, bang, bang. The coffin pounded. The church shook. Screams erupted. Thomas's eyes bulged. His face went white. No, it can't be, he said. Father Daniel crossed himself. Open the coffin, he said. Sarah took a breath. Her hands trembled. This was it. She turned to Paul. Do it, she said. Paul and Mr. Henry moved. They grabbed the lid. A cold wind blew through. Thomas shrieked. No, don't open it, he yelled. Don't open it. Too late. They lifted the lid. Sarah cried out, James! She fell to her knees. Tears blurred her eyes. James was there. He was alive. His body shook. His skin was pale. His lips were dry. His eyes opened weakly. He was conscious. James! Sarah screamed. She rushed to him. Her hands touched his face. James, I'm here, she said. I'm here. Emily burst into tears. Papa, I'm here, she sobbed. A faint breath left James's lips. Gasps filled the church. James wasn't dead. He'd been buried alive. Villagers stepped back. Some cried in shock. Others covered their mouths. Paul took off his jacket. He wrapped it around James. Quick, we need help, he said. Father Daniel knelt by James. He held his hand. Someone get water, he said. His voice was calm but urgent. Martha ran to find some. Sarah sobbed. Her tears fell on James's hand. Don't leave me, James, she said. Don't leave Emily. Emily held her father's arm. Her small hands squeezed. She hiccuped. James's lips moved. He was too weak to speak. Then a scream cut through. No, this is a demon. Everyone turned. Thomas crawled on the floor. His face was twisted. No, James is dead, he yelled. He has to be. Paul's anger flared. He punched Thomas. Thomas fell hard. Shut up, Paul shouted. Thomas whimpered. No, he can't be alive, he cried. Sarah stood. Her eyes burned. Why are you so afraid, Thomas? She asked. Her voice cut like a knife. Thomas sobbed. He backed away. I didn't mean to, he said. Mr. Henry roared. You buried him alive. Villagers gasped. Their fear turned to anger. Mrs. Agnes held her rosary. Tears ran down her face. He's the devil, she said. The true devil. Martha hissed. Call the police, she said. This can't go unpunished. Father Daniel nodded. He signaled Paul. We need to get James outside, he said. He needs care now. Paul and some men lifted James. Sarah held his hand. Her voice broke. James, hold on, she said. You have to live. Emily sniffled. She patted his face. Papa, wake up, she said. I miss you. James breathed weakly. His eyes met Sarah's. He'd heard it all. He'd nearly been buried alive. His daughter had saved him. Outside, sirens wailed. Police cars screeched to a stop. An ambulance followed. Sheriff Brooks stepped out. His eyes scanned the crowd. What's going on here? He asked. Paul ran forward. Thomas tried to kill James, he shouted. He faked the death. He buried him alive. The church buzzed. Sheriff Brooks faced Thomas. Arrest him, he said. His voice was cold. 2 officers grabbed Thomas. No, I'm innocent, he yelled. He fought. The cuffs clicked tight. They forced him down. You'll pay for this, Paul growled. Sheriff Brooks turned to Sarah. We'll investigate fully, he said. James goes to the hospital now. Sarah nodded. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at James. His breaths were weak, but a light shone in his eyes. "You're going to live," she said. "You're going to live." Emily smiled. Her small hands held his. "Papa, can we go home?" she asked. James's lips moved. His voice was faint. "Yes," he said. "Let's go home." 3 days later, at St. Mary's Hospital, sunlight streamed through the window. It lit James's face. His breathing was steadier. His cheeks had some color. His eyes were still heavy. He looked at Sarah and Emily beside him. "Papa." Emily climbed onto the bed. She wrapped her arms around him. Her tiny hands touched his face. She checked he was real. "You're back," she said. James smiled weakly. His eyes were warm. "I'm sorry, my love," he said. His voice was rough. Sarah held his hand tight. Tears fell. "Do you know how scared we were?" she asked. James nodded slowly. His face showed sorrow. "I heard everything," he said. Sarah froze. "What do you mean?" she asked. James took a deep breath. His voice was thick. "When I was in that coffin," he said, "I couldn't move. I couldn't yell. But I heard you. I heard Emily. I heard Thomas lying." "Oh, God," Sarah sobbed. She hugged him. Emily clung to his arm. Her voice was bright. "But Mama saved you," she said. "I heard you calling Papa." James looked at her. His eyes misted. "Thank you, my little angel," he said. Emily beamed. She hugged him tight. Outside the room, Paul and Father Daniel waited. Sarah stepped out. Paul spoke. "Thomas is locked up," he said. "He's facing trial." Sarah nodded. Her heart was still heavy. Father Daniel touched her shoulder. "James was saved," he said. "That's what matters." Sarah breathed deep. She gave a small smile. "Yes," she said. "He's alive." 1 week later, the courtroom was full. Villagers came to see justice. Thomas was brought in. His hands were cuffed. His face was thin. His eyes showed fear. The prosecutor read the charges. "Thomas Reed," he said, "charged with attempted murder, faking a death, burying James Reed alive." Murmurs filled the room. Sarah focused on Thomas. He wasn't smug now. He was a coward. "The sentence comes now," the judge said. "Wait," a voice called. Everyone turned. James stood there. He leaned on a cane. His gaze was steady. He stared at Thomas. "I have something to say," he said. The judge nodded. "Go ahead," he said. James stepped forward. His eyes never left Thomas. "Thomas, I don't hate you," he said. The room went quiet. "But I despise you," he said. His voice was sharp. "You betrayed our family. You lost your honor. You'll face what's coming." Thomas fell to his knees. He sobbed. No one pitied him. The judge banged the gavel. "Thomas Reed," he said, "sentenced to 25 years. The crowd cheered. Sarah closed her eyes. She breathed deep. It was over. 1 month later, the Reed home glowed in sunlight. James stood on the porch. He looked at the fields. His hand held Sarah's. Emily ran in the yard. Her laughter rang out. "We're really home," Sarah whispered. James nodded. His eyes were peaceful. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you both." Sarah leaned on his shoulder. Her heart felt light. James squeezed her hand. "I'll never leave you and Emily again," he whispered. Emily ran up. She hugged them both. "We're a family," she said. "No one can take us apart." Sarah smiled. She kissed Emily's forehead. "That's right, my love," she said. "We'll always be together." The sun shone down. It lit a new start. This story shows truth and love win. Sarah and Emily never gave up. Their love saved James. The villain faced justice. It teaches us a mother's heart, and family are the strongest. It warns against greed and lies. No crime stays hidden forever. Righteousness always triumphs. Story, please give it a like. subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps us sharing tales like this. We're so grateful. See you soon.